Hello, everyone, and welcome to this year's GFINDER Neglected Disease Report launch. My name is Dr. Lindsay Keir, and I'm the Director of Science and Policy at Impact Global Health. Welcome to the meeting. If you could keep yourself on mute throughout proceedings, that would be most appreciated. And if you do enter and have yourself on mic, please do mute yourself just so that everyone can hear the conversation flow. This is our 17th year producing the GFINDER Neglected Disease Report, but it's also a year of firsts for us. This is the first GFINDER Neglected Disease Report that we're launching as Impact Global Health after our rebrand last year from Policy Cures Research in October. It's also the first time that we produced the Neglected Disease Report as a digital report that you can now check out on our website. It went live yesterday, and there's loads of insights that you can dig into there. So please do follow up on that and check it out after this session if you haven't done so already. Also, if you have any questions or comments or feedback on that, do get in touch with us because we'd love to hear from you. If you don't know already, the title of this year's report is Smart Decisions, which I think we can all agree are needed for global health R&D. It's been a turbulent week and a half for global health and geopolitics in general. And I don't think we can dive into an event like this without acknowledging that. However, rather than dwelling on the negatives, over the next 90 minutes, we want to focus on how we can come together as a global health R&D community and deliver the biggest impact that we have with the resources that we have available for neglected disease R&D. So as we move through proceedings today, consider yourselves, what smart decisions do you want to see in the next year or future years ahead to make real world progress for neglected diseases? Please share your thoughts, your ideas in the chat if these come to mind, or put your hand up and come and tell us about them as we enter some of the Q&A sessions in today's meeting. Before we dive into the meat of the discussion, here's the agenda for today. So we'll be focusing on 4 key themes that I think we all grapple with in some way, shape or form. These are going to be who is funding what and why, making smart decisions, evaluating your own priorities, and strengthening your investment cases. So we'll look at each one of these in turn, and we'll hear insights from our Impact Global Health team members, as well as some brilliant guest speakers that I'm delighted to have joined us today. The first, Bethan Hughes, New Products Director at Novartis Global Health, whose bio is now on your screen and was shared with you in advance, and Jagoe, the Executive Vice President of Access and Product Management at Medicines for Malaria Ventures. I think if you want to check their bios out more, they were shared with you in advance, and obviously check out their profiles on LinkedIn. Each session we're going to last about 15 minutes, and after each we will have a short Q&A. If we want to hear from you, what are you thinking? What has sparked a question in your mind? As we go through the sessions, please feel free to put any questions that come to mind in the Q&A, which you will see at the top of your screen, and any thoughts or comments you have or questions for our team in the chat. These will be monitored throughout. We may answer some of your questions live in the session. Some of them I'll be able to ask as we proceed to the Q&A session. And also, as I mentioned before, if you've got a question and want to come on mic and ask the panel directly, please put your hand up and I'll call upon you to come on off mute and ask your question live. At the very end of the session, we're going to have another probably 5 or 10 minutes to answer any last minute burning questions that you have that we haven't covered in any of the other sessions. So do keep that in mind before we close out this session. I hope you're excited by the agenda. We're really excited to share the findings with you. So without further ado, let's kick things off. Our first session is going to be who is funding what and why. And I'm delighted to now hand over to my colleague Paul Barnsley, Research and Analysis Lead at Impact Global Health and this year's lead author of the GFINDER Neglected Disease Report. Paul's going to give us an overview and then also call upon colleagues Maddie and Alex to give us some disease-specific insights on TB and HIV. Paul, over to you.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. And everyone can see my screen, I hope.
Yes, we can. Thanks, Paul.
That's great. Well then, let's begin by recapping our story so far. Global funding for neglected disease R&D peaked in 2018, and since then it's trended gently downwards in a way we find worrying, but which doesn't really seem to justify any kind of panic. Last year we looked at 2022's data, which did show a big drop, about 10%. But when we dug into the numbers, we found that that was mostly just the result of inflation eroding the value of fixed grants. So frustrating for product developers, yes, but again, not really a cause for panic. In 2023, inflation dropped back closer to normal levels and overall funding stayed roughly the same, down by a little under 2% once we adjust for some new survey participants. So our headline message is once again one of relative stability. Those gradual declines have left funding a long way below its peak and below its average over the previous decade, but there's never been a moment where we felt like funders were abandoning neglected disease R&D. Now, let's dive into this year's data a little bit. This picture too suggests a reasonable amount of continuity. Most of the money still went to those big three diseases and various kinds of multi-disease funding. That's a combination of platforms, core funding to multi-disease organisations like the EDCDP, vector control, and the always unhelpful other R&D, which just means money funders can't or won't adequately describe. There's a long-term trend here in each of those big three diseases, which we'll come back to, and in non-disease specific funding. It's now increased 9 years in a row, and last year was the first time it finished higher than one of the big three. A big part of that story is platform technologies, and we'll come back to that too. So, what changed? As always, the best place for analysis of specific diseases is in the report, where we go into a lot of effort to explain and contextualize these changes. But the headline here is that HIV went down by a lot and TB went up, for reasons we'll come to shortly. The picture changes a lot if we zoom in on the largest proportional shifts. Here you can see leptospirosis going from just over $1 million to about 2.5, and funding for trachoma falling all the way down to zero, albeit from less than $200,000 the year before. It's important to be aware of the longer-term trends in funding for each disease. Those three sort of mid-ranking diseases, leprosy, snakebite, and dengue, are all at or close to their record highs in 2023. And in all three cases, that growth partly reflects an influx of private sector funding. And the big fall in the pneumonia and meningitis group is the tail end of a long, steep downward trend that's taken them from over 130 million in 2012 to less than 20 million today. Now, let's look at the changes in who provided the money. That's a big absolute but much smaller relative fall in funding from high-income country governments, mostly the US, being almost entirely offset by that big rise in philanthropic, mostly Gates Foundation funding. That shift took philanthropic funding to its highest level since 2008 and left governments with their lowest ever share of global funding. We saw a substantial and heartening rise in LMIC funding, most of it from India, and a relatively small net decline in industry funding that's being obscured here by a big new SME participant. So stability, but definitely not stasis. Here too, we're trying to get away from just reacting to one-year trends. Those big changes in Gates Foundation and US government funding each form part of a meaningful trend. Again, we'll come back to those, and aren't just the cyclical shift we see when a government like Japan only funds PDPs every second year. But how much of what I end up talking about every year is just a new batch of random numbers? That's something that's bothered me for quite a while when I stood up last year to explain why biologics funding went up so much and then come back this year to tell you why it went down again. I want to talk about how we've gotten better at extracting meaning from the data, but one obvious solution is just to build a statistical model of funding trends over time, see if it can make sense of what's happening, or if all of this is just noise. We did that, and the good news is that it mostly can. This is an autoregressive moving average, a REMA model of total funding over time. It's a dumb model in the sense that it doesn't know anything at all about global health R&D, it just views them as a sequence of numbers. But it can mostly come to terms with what's happened to total funding over the last 17 years. That's the very close fit between the yellow and orange lines. And great news, it thinks funding's going to go back up. If we ask it to zoom in on what happened to vaccine funding on the right there, which, spoiler alert, has fallen a lot over the last half-decade, it gets a bit more confused. That's the poorer fit between forecast and what actually happened, and it thinks the decline is going to continue. Now, I don't want to oversell all of this. The model's not putting us out of business anytime soon, and it is, you will note, directionally wrong about what happened to both vaccines and overall funding in 2023. But I think we're now starting to assemble enough data that we're not going to be jumping at shadows quite so much in the future. The main reason, though, that we're getting better at understanding what's happening in the R&D landscape is that we have access to more pieces of the puzzle than when the GFinder survey began in 2008. We now track the pipeline and product approvals so that we can tie that steep decline in pneumonia and meningitis funding I referenced earlier to the launch of new vaccines for each of those diseases, or the fall for onchocerciasis drug R&D to the approval of moxidectin. And because we now gather on disbursements as they occur and future funding plans as they're announced, we can situate the big rises in Gates and TB funding in the context of their plan to invest $400 million in trials of the M72 TB vaccine. M72 is one of the other big stories in this year's data, and something my colleague Maddie Kearney is going to talk about a little bit in a few minutes. It comes in the context of a long-term decline in vaccine R&D for almost everything else. We've talked a little bit about how the decline in pneumonia and meningitis mostly follows the launch of new products, which have done a lot to lessen the burden of those diseases. The same is broadly true of diarrheal diseases like rotavirus and cholera, and obviously malaria, which has seen R21 and RTSS over this period. In general, we're enthusiastic about funders changing direction when the facts on the ground have shifted, and in particular, we understand the need to shift from R&D to manufacturing, access, and distribution once there's actually a product to distribute. But the big outlier here is HIV, which has experienced by far the largest decline in vaccine funding without ending up with a working vaccine. That's something my colleague Alex Ankomah will be digging a little deeper into. So one big trend is the gradual move away from vaccine R&D, with the big exception of M72 for TB. The other consistent theme we've picked up over the last few years is that industry is starting to move into new areas, especially tropical diseases that have the potential to spread in response to climate change. The poster child for this trend is dengue R&D. This graph shows the earlier explosion in private sector dengue vaccine funding. That led us to conclude that there was too big a potential market to label it as neglected anymore. That's the catch-22 of industry funding for neglected disease, and we removed it from the survey. So that's why the vaccine funding disappears in 2013. It didn't stop, it just stopped being counted. But it also didn't really end up producing any great vaccines, which is why now, 10 years later, we're seeing sudden growth of industry funding for dengue drug R&D, something that we've traditionally believed wasn't an area that pharma companies would explore on a commercial basis. Now, climate scientists have been predicting for years that a warmer climate would spread the Aedes mosquito, which carries dengue, into places like eastern China and Japan. And that's basically what happened in 2024, with several major outbreaks, including one in parts of rural Pakistan previously outside its range. So we can expect to see a big increase in the need for, and probably also the commercial potential of, products targeting diseases like dengue that are set to encounter new populations. Dengue is the leading edge, but as the tropics expand, so too will the areas exposed to tropical disease. That shifting climate should help to make neglected disease R&D an easier sell to tropic-adjacent high-income countries, the same way it's boosted the market for dengue. So it's strange to see the US, which typically leads the way in R&D and which is seeing an uptick not just in dengue, but also malaria, Chagas disease, even leprosy, significantly reduce its funding over the last 2 years. Again, I want to try and separate the signal from the noise here. The biggest player is obviously the US NIH, and that 2-year dip in their funding doesn't yet feel like the kind of trend that needs to be explained. We're still well within their normal kind of range. But that feels less true of the other 3 organisations shown here, each of which has moved from being a moderately significant contributor to a bit of an afterthought. Let's zoom in on them. The CDC seems to have pretty abruptly stopped funding, just $280,000 in 2023, and USAID has gradually fallen by more than half from its peak. A little more complicated is what's going on with the DoD, which used to spend quite a lot of money on what it insists on calling bioarmor for its warfighters. Its disease-specific funding, especially vaccine programs, basically just disappeared, leaving it with not much more than snakebite that's specifically focused on neglected disease. But it's still spending a reasonable amount on projects which it categorises as targeted at emerging infectious disease, but which we think may be relevant to neglected disease in the future, and which we therefore include in their funding totals. So that's why I've partitioned out disease-specific funding on the right, so you can see what the DoD thinks it's spending on neglected disease, which in 2023 was very little. One final point, which ties back to that ongoing rise in multi-disease funding I pointed to earlier. We mostly haven't seen neglected disease budgets cannibalised to fund COVID or other emerging infectious disease R&D, the way we feared we would in 2020. But we have seen a big rise in funding, especially platform R&D, that's included in our neglected disease figures, but which is only really intended to stop epidemics. And look, our logic here is sound enough. It really is the case that most public sector platform research could end up being applied to malaria or TB, the same way mRNA technology is being converted for use against both those diseases right now. But once the platforms exist, someone actually has to fund those adaptation projects. So while our figures say that it's a fair trade when the DoD, and to a lesser extent other funders, scraps a moderately advanced vaccines program in favour of platforms that might one day replace them, it makes me a little nervous, seeing that multi-disease line grow year after year, knowing that in many cases it's not being driven by an actual focus on neglected disease. Okay, so that's enough from me from now. There's a little more to come from my colleagues, and I'll be back in a little while to talk about what funders ought to be doing with this information. Let's start with Maddie Kearney, who's going to look specifically at TB funding. Maddie, would you like to jump in?
Great, thanks, Paul. As Paul alluded to, vaccine funding overall and for most individual neglected diseases has been declining over the past few years, while funding for TB vaccines has done the opposite, increasing by almost $60 million in the 2 years from 2021, which is a rise of over 70%. This rise in funding for TB vaccines is almost entirely due to increased investment in the M72 vaccine candidate, which is under development by the Gates Medical Research Institute, with most of the increase in funding coming from the Gates Foundation and Wellcome. These increases are set to keep coming in the near future, as the Gates Foundation has only dispersed around a third of its committed $400 million for the phase 3 trials. M72 has shown around 50% efficacy in phase 2 trials, a small but meaningful increase on the current standard of care, the BCG vaccine, which offers around 45% protection. Because of the scale of TB infections globally, even a 5% increase in efficacy would avert millions of deaths and tens of millions of infections over the next 25 years, particularly as more drug-resistant strains of tuberculosis evolve. While if successful, M72 would have a huge impact, this funding has come at the expense of other neglected diseases. Both its major funders have reduced their non-TB funding over the past 2 years, and at the same time as funding for TB vaccines has increased by 70%. Vaccine funding for pneumonia has dropped by 85% and rheumatic fever by 73%, just to name a few. Unfortunately, not everything can be prioritised, so let's hope in this case the decisions made by funders pay off. I'll now hand over to my colleague Alex, who's going to talk a bit about HIV funding. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you very much, Maddie. So funding for LMIC targeted R&D fell, HIV R&D fell by 11% to a record low of $1.2 billion, following significant decreases from two major funders, the industry and US NIH. In 2023, majority of this investment came from just three funders, the two I mentioned earlier, in addition to Gates Foundation. And so in HIV, we need a more diversified funding base, especially from LMIC funders, so the products developed are suitable, accessible, and affordable. This heavy reliance on high-income countries to fund HIV R&D leaves the landscape quite vulnerable to their priorities and policies, and this could leave people living with HIV in LMICs without products to meet their needs. For HIV R&D funding, we run the risk of being a victim of our own success. Improved antiretroviral therapies, pre-exposure prophylaxis, and diagnostics have significantly reduced new infections, HIV-related deaths. We've also seen improvements in ART use and people living with HIV who know their status. So HIV in itself is not viewed as much of a challenge in the largest funder countries themselves, leading to a deprioritization in R&D funding decisions, but more of a focus on treatment access and affordability. For vaccines, it hit an all-time low in 2023 in terms of investments, while microbicide funding dropped by over 90% below its 2008 peak, as a result of a shrink in the funding base to just three organizations. And so when we look at this decline in HIV vaccine and microbicide R&D funding, it's as a result of a constellation of multiple factors, including the discontinuation of late-stage candidates, as this refers to the Mosaico and Imbokodo trials that ended unsuccessfully recently, dampening enthusiasm, and subsequent reallocation of resources. So we see most pharma companies have scaled back, shifting their funding to less costly early-stage trials, leveraging insights from these failures. However, these funding reductions across both early and late-stage research raises concern that we may not be replenishing the vaccine pipeline at a rate fast enough to keep up with the attrition. And all this is happening amid evolving perspectives within the HIV community, where even actors are asking, do we still need a vaccine in the age of long-acting injectables? We've also noticed a shift to multi-pronged approaches, moving from the HIV-specific microbicides to multi-purpose prevention technologies. And this allows more than one health condition to be addressed simultaneously, like contraception and other STIs, including HIV. And this is also good for the patients because it reduces the number of interactions the patient needs to have with already strained healthcare systems. So I would say in this era of choice for HIV, including ART and PrEP becoming more widely available, and highly effective at reducing transmission, we need to continually assess whether existing products are meeting the needs of those living with HIV and at-risk populations, and if any R&D gaps remain. Therefore, aligning our R&D efforts with these specific needs to ensure sustained progress. And I'll hand over back to Dr. Keir to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, Maddie, and Paul, for sharing those great insights. And that is just scratching the surface of the analysis that's been done in the GFINDER report. So I do encourage everyone to dig in to the online digital report. There are many, many more diseases that we could dive into. There aren't any specific questions related to this in the chat. People were asking about slides to accompany Alex's narrative. He didn't have any slides. It was just a kind of verbal narrative that he was sharing. So that's why the slides have come off screen. We do want this to be a bit more of a discussion and conversation with you all. So that's why the slides will not be always on the screen, only for selected speakers. In lieu of any other questions, Paul, I'm going to ask you a question just to follow up on that. You and the whole Impact Global Health team have been thinking very deeply about this data this year. And the GFINDER report offers great insights into the funding trends and also contextualises those now with future funding trends and the product pipeline. How do you want policymakers, decision makers, funders to be using this information to inform what they do next?
Thanks, Lindsay. So, I mean, I'm going to talk about this in a bit of detail, what our recommendations are in a second. I guess we are conscious that we don't know everything. We know a lot more than we did, but we now, I think, are starting to understand enough to give some suggestions, some high-level kind of directional suggestions about funding. But it's very difficult to sit where we are and say, oh no, you're spending too much on TB, spend more on leprosy, or vice versa. So we're dipping our toe in the water and making recommendations, but we're certainly not. I don't think anyone can ever be a one-stop shop saying, here's where the money should go. So we try and pick up on what we think are concerning trends, but some of what we do is still a watching brief.
Okay, well, why don't we dig into making these smart decisions and move on to our next session, which will hopefully stimulate a little bit more conversation and thinking into this. So obviously we are facing kind of flat funding, essentially. There is a limited pot of money that we have to play with to support neglected disease R&D. So now, how do we maximise that? How do we make it work for us in the best way possible? I'm going to hand over to Paul now to share some of the insights from the discussion section of the report. And Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think you're sharing slides for this part, just because people may ask, have you got slides or not? Can I just check?
No slides. It's just going to be watching my head, I'm afraid, people.
That's wonderful. We like to see your face,
I'll do my best to be animated. So,
over to you.
Thanks, Lindsay. So we've talked in a fair bit of detail about what this year's data tells us. And for years, the next question from funders has always been, what do you think we ought to do about it? And for years, we've responded, well, that sounds really hard. No. This year, though, we've got a shiny new name, a shiny new mission, a shiny new grant application. It's been gently made clear to me that no is no longer an acceptable answer. So we're going to very cautiously talk a little bit about what choices we think funders ought to be making, while acknowledging this is an incredibly difficult question and one we're only a little bit qualified to answer. So no slides or data this time, just a lot of opinions, I suppose. We've said this year's report is about funders making smart choices. That was difficult choices through most of the editing process because I'm more of a glass half empty kind of person. So funders should make smart choices. That's obviously pretty glib and unhelpful. It's like one of those YouTube videos where they show you how to tie a bow tie, but the second last step is just now tie the tie into a bow. But we've tried to dig into it a little bit and what we mean by it. So first, just the act of making choices, of consciously setting priorities is a good start. There's not enough money to do everything that's worth doing in global health, and choosing expensive late-stage trials for a TB vaccine means choosing not to fund something else. You can do that deliberately, or you can stumble into it by accident because you ran out of money by the end of your grant year, but you definitely can't magic away that choice. So when we look at the big long-term shifts in funding for meningitis vaccines, say, that looks like a strategy, like choices being made. Hopefully they're the right ones, but at least funders seem to be picking a direction. Second, the traditional way to end a report when you've told there needs to be a call to action and you don't really have one is to say that there ought to be more funding. And again, that sounds dismissive in a way I don't intend it to, like just tie it into a bow. Impact Global Health has been very active in making the case for increased funding for neglected disease in what I hope is a very robust, persuasive way. That funding delivers a 400-to-1 return via the societal value of improved health, that it boosts the economies and scientific infrastructure of the nations where the research takes place, that it generates spillover benefits in the form of new technologies or improved regional stability, that R&D is a form of health security, a form of climate adaptation. So yes, it's a cliche to say that there ought to be more funding, but, well, there ought to be more funding. Now, at this point, when you think there ought to be more funding, but you don't want to sound naive, it's traditional to invoke innovative financing mechanisms. And as a health economist, one who can't reliably pronounce psoriasis, who doesn't really know how a conjugate vaccine works, with this I feel like I'm on more solid ground. To the point where I wrote approximately 2,000 words on innovative financing mechanisms in the report, but then took them all out because no one seemed all that interested. If you'd like to read 2,000 words of me talking about innovative financing mechanisms, please just message me after the launch. Anyway, to briefly summarise, most innovative financing mechanisms are smart ways of tricking people into giving you slightly more money by shifting it from budget lines you don't care about to the one you do. They're not some sort of financial perpetual motion machine that reliably makes there be more money. They're definitely not an alternative to making smart choices about the money you do have. And I think there's maybe a worrying tendency to talk about them as if they were. That you can attend a conference and all agree that late-stage research is super important, but so is the early-stage stuff. And we need better vaccines, but also better diagnostics. But it's vital not to neglect improved treatments, and also target the root causes of disease via vector control and public health and a One Health approach, including livestock and household pets. And look, all of those are at least partly right, but you can't just magically then paper over the cracks in the accounting by intoning aggregator fund or innovative pool mechanisms thrice at the end of the last session. As I say, there's a lot more words, some of them a bit mean, but that's the flavour of my objection. One thing we talk about in the report, and this is point 3, I suppose, is that funders need a working model of the product and disease ecosystem they're going to be launching into. A successful launch for M72 presumably means there will be substantially less TB around, and that the other tools intended to manage its burden and spread will have correspondingly less value than they did in a pre-M72 world. Not no value, but less. Or it actually means that you have a real shot at eliminating TB from certain populations, and all those other products suddenly become more valuable because they might help you finish the job. And it's critically important to know which of those two worlds you'll be living in, which areas of funding complement what you're already trying to do, and which ones are really substitutes. If M72 comes in at 50% efficacy, then elimination is probably off the table, bearing in mind that I'm not an epidemiologist. And you need to gently tell the TB therapeutics folks that less TB just means less need for drugs. To think about the future in that way and what it implies for your product portfolio, you need the right data about the future funding and product landscape. That's our job, at least in part. And you need to know what you're trying to achieve. And so I've got another unhelpfully glib solution. You should optimize for maximum impact. Just tie it into a bow. But having been part of a funder's decision-making process and seen how that sausage gets made, I'd acknowledge both that it's an incredibly difficult job and that there are easy ways to make it run better. I also have 2,000 words on multi-criteria decision analysis for anyone who's interested. It's very easy to get tied up in number of clinical trials or novel mechanism of action and lose sight of the people you're ultimately supposed to be helping. Don't do that. I want to suggest that this advice is maybe a bit less obvious than it sounds, because it's not just a matter of trying to maximize the impact of your product portfolio, but at the collective impact of product development generally. It takes a village to cure a village. And that means being aware of what others are up to, but also taking into account the blind spots in what other funders are willing to support. How can you fill those gaps? The obvious example here is the US Department of Defense, who we spoke about earlier. They're explicitly not trying to minimize the burden of neglected disease. They just want to know what kind of bioarmor their warfighters will need to operate asymmetrically in austere environments. And if any of that R&D happens to spill over into meeting LMIC needs, that's just a happy accident. What assets have the recent DoD cutbacks left sitting on the shelf, for example? But another thing we talked about in the report, before cutting it down to a more manageable length, was the weird consistency of the share of R&D funding that goes to basic research. What you'd intuitively expect, and what we see with EIDs, is for the big lump of funding associated with the portfolio of products to gradually make its way through the pipeline, from basic research all the way to post-registration studies, like a snake that swallowed an unusually large hamster. But instead, the share of funding going to basic research has barely budged in 17 years, even as the active pipeline has vastly increased in size. And I think, and this is just speculation on my part, that reflects the huge role played by the NIH, which has provided 43% of all global R&D funding over that period. And the fact that it sees itself as a scientific research organisation first, not really a maximizer of health impact. So what gaps are created by the fact that 43% of our funding comes from an organisation more driven by curiosity than impact? Okay, so in reverse order, that's know what you're trying to achieve, know what's going on around you, acknowledge that funds are limited, and decide on a strategy and update it when things change. I've got one more glib call to action. Spend less on each product so you can afford to fund more of them. Now, obviously, I'm not going to solve R&D cost bloat in 2 minutes at the end of an already long presentation. But coming to the clinical trial literature as an outsider, one with an academic background in optimizing under uncertainty, is just an incredibly frustrating experience. 2,000 words, anyone who wants them. There's a lot to be learned from just looking at international best practice and getting bang for your buck. We point to the UK's recovery trial in the report, and by trying to build R&D capacity in low-income and therefore lower-cost countries. But my personal bugbear, and I'm conscious this is something more within the power of regulators than funders, are the systems for assessing statistical certainty that have been elevated to sort of gospel tenets of medical ethics instead of a formal trade-off between cost and risk. There's this whole discipline of value of information analysis, 2,000 words, that seems to have been sidelined in favour of tests made up by an Irish beer scientist for assessing the purity of Guinness. If more than half the cost of a new product, once we already know that it's safe, goes to proving to an Irish beer scientist's satisfaction that it works, what if we just didn't do that? What if, like the governments of Ghana and Nigeria did with the R21 malaria vaccine, if we're sure it's safe and pretty sure it works, we start giving it to people and probably saving their lives, and just rely on real-world observational data to find out if we were right? Now, that's a complicated trade-off. Maybe we wasted millions on a dud vaccine. Maybe we harmed public trust. But we need to treat it like a calculated risk, not some sort of mortal sin against the 95% confidence interval. So there's probably, perhaps even hopefully, some controversial stuff in all of that. It's hard to know how everyone's responding over a screen, but opinions were demanded and opinions were duly given. I think it's time I handed over to the people who actually do this for a living for some genuine real-world data. But thank you all for your patience.
Thank you, Paul. You've definitely stimulated the questions coming through, and I think you've talked yourself into doing a bit more work because there's lots of requests to see those 2,000 words that you've written on the innovative financing and also the multi-decision analysis that you've done as well. So you might have to follow up on that when you've given yourself some more work. There are also some questions though. One that is very topical, and I think I know the answer to, but we'll ask it anyway because I'm sure it's on a lot of people's minds. Have you already started to model what could be the impact of the new US administration on global health R&D funding?
No, is the answer. We will. It is obviously extremely significant and important, and the honest truth is we have been extremely caught up in preparing for this event and hoping that nothing too much would change on the ground in the weeks immediately in advance. That did not prove to be the case. So yes, it's something we'll be looking at, and we will try and get back to our audience relatively quickly with some thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely agree on that one. It's obviously front and centre of many people's minds. And then we've got another question from Val Smewen, who has asked, says, you always enjoyed the GFinder report, but a reminder that in some cases research funding may be shifting to match the shifting global burden of diseases in low and middle income countries. And these are for things that we don't track, obviously NCDs, mental health, injury and accidents. Can you compare the shifts you report to a total budget for research that benefits low and middle income country populations?
Again, no, and we would love to. It's a really fair question, and our mission has gradually grown from where we started, but it's still a small mission relative to the overall question of what's being spent on public health to benefit LMICs. We've kind of drawn ourselves tough boundaries, and this was at a time back when there were, I think, 6 people in PCR as it then was. We have grown bigger and bolder, but we are still not an everything organisation. But obviously that is a key part of the question. It's possible. I've spoken about rational shifts being made from R&D to product distribution, but that's still a very R&D focused view of things. It's possible that a rational shift is being made from neglected disease, communicable disease R&D to other areas of public health, and that those are smart decisions that shouldn't bother us. Sitting where we sit, it's impossible to know that, but it's absolutely a fair point that declining R&D is not necessarily the wrong choice, but we do emphasise that R&D is a real force multiplier, I guess, in a way that some areas of public health aren't, that 400 to 1 return is hard to achieve with conventional health spending. But look, I don't want to step on the toes of other organisations that know more about the impact of, say, mental health spending than I do.
So Val, you put your hand up. Do you want to come on camera and take yourself off mute just to say something else in response to Paul?
I would, if that's okay. Now, thanks so much. As I say, I've been a follower of the GFinder work for many, many years, since the inception, actually. So I think it is just worth, in the framing and the discussion that you presented earlier, if you could, would it be useful at least to frame the data that you've got in that context? That I didn't hear really anything about that, even as a possibility, that and that research is still the same. The same multiplier effect of research is still there, whether it's research on malaria or research on diabetes and HIV, for example, or just diabetes and in a low-income setting, for example. So I think that's what I would like to hear in the narrative that you're giving, that setting. And I think my question about the data source, that is something that I think kind of used to be done by the 1090 GAP people way back. If anyone on the call remembers those days, there used to be that kind of assessment of the total amount of R&D, and colleagues were asking me about this the other day, and we don't think there is that data. I would agree with you at the moment, but it sounds like you've just got a grant award, probably from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I would imagine. Maybe that's something you could talk to about adding in, because it would be really useful to pick that up. Thank you.
Thank you, Val, for that feedback. I think it's interesting to hear, and I think you've struck on a good point in that we can only do and we rely on grant funding to do the work as well. And as Paul has said, we are a fairly small organisation. I don't think we can take on everything ourselves, but I do think it is a really good point in terms of how we contextualise the data. And we're all drawing from the same pot of money, essentially, with a lot of these funders. There are multiple priorities, even beyond NTDs, that we have to consider as well. Thank you very much. I think I'm going to wrap up this session now, because we've still got more to come. Thank you, Paul, for your insights. As you have alluded to, we're now going to move on to the next session. And we're going to consider evaluating your own priorities in a global health context. And now I'd like to invite our guest speaker, Bethan Hughes, to share her thoughts on this. She is an employee of Novartis Global Health, but will be speaking in her own personal capacity today. And I'm going to hand over to Bethan to give her thoughts before we open the floor up for some questions. So do get thinking of questions for Bethan as well. Bethan, over to you.
Thank you, Lindsay. And congratulations to you and the Impact Global Health team for another insightful report. And thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this discussion on how priorities are set. I'll add a caveat for the audience to know I previously worked at Wellcome, but I left in March 2021 after a decade of supporting teams developing new products that address unmet needs in healthcare. During that time, Wellcome changed its approach and funding. I'll explain why later, but many of the ways in which R&D projects were selected remained the same. Key drivers for how Wellcome made their funding decisions at that time that contributed many candidates to the pipeline that is tracked by GFinder were unmet need, the capabilities of the applicants, and partnerships. I'll take each in turn. The global unmet need was the most important driver. We couldn't consider supporting disease areas that were already well addressed by industry, where our support could at best lead to incremental benefit. Instead, we could only consider areas where new interventions or diagnostics were urgently needed that could lead to a significant change in the clinical management of a disease. Consequently, these were predominantly disease areas that lacked commercial potential, such as neglected tropical diseases. But sometimes we also supported areas where life science investors were not willing to take the risk, for example, if science was novel. If other funders were heavily engaged in a particular disease area, then we considered how supporting an application would be complementary to their funding. to avoid duplication of effort. And of course, sometimes we collaborated with other funders, either on individual applications or through joint funding schemes. The second key driver was the capabilities of the applicants. And this was demonstrated by the composition of the team, the feasibility of the project plan, and if they had submitted a realistic budget. The challenge with this particular requirement is that successful applicants would come from experienced translational research teams, which meant that it wasn't possible to support capacity building, capability building, sorry. This could have an unintended consequence of not supporting neglected areas because experienced researchers were more likely to work in disease areas where they could get more funding. And the third key driver was partnerships. Wherever possible, we encouraged academic applicants to collaborate with industry. The reason for this was that Wellcome could only fund one part of the R&D process. We said that we were a gap funder, meaning that we provided funding to de-risk a project and hoped that if an industry collaborator was involved in the project, they would choose to then continue development. This approach wasn't always successful because often the partnership would stop when the funding ended. But it did mean that the team was supported by the capabilities of industry collaborators and their own capabilities improved. Until 2015, the innovations team at Wellcome funded in this way, providing gap funding that could only support small parts of development, such as from discovery to phase 1. At that point, we had something like 200 active projects in 108 different indications. This didn't give us many shots on goal per disease area for true impact. We therefore decided to pivot and created a 5-year innovation to impact strategy. This is where we reviewed our internal and external pipelines to see where we had natural groupings of interventions in specific disease areas. So rather than just funding a single drug development or vaccine program, we could develop a portfolio to increase the probability of success. We considered where we could collaborate with other funders, like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to complement their activities, and also where there were funding gaps, but where collaborators, such as product development partners like DNDi and industry partners, had the right scientific expertise to address a disease area. Taking this approach, we could also look more holistically at the gaps in the translational space for those disease areas and consider enabling activities that could also help that community. With this new approach, we also considered how we could measure impact through key performance indicators, such as capacity building, patients reached through clinical trials, and then the potential that new interventions could have on the target populations. But of course, as a consequence, there were many disease areas that we no longer supported. For example, where there were no funders, as well as a lack of expertise in the translational research community. Funders, unfortunately, do spend a lot of time disappointing applicants and award holders when strategies change. They recognise there's no shortage of diseases that need support, but they also want to achieve impact, which requires greater focus in fewer areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethan. Thank you for those insights. And I think, I worked at Wellcome as well, and we worked there at the same time. So I think it's really interesting to hear those insights from a funder. And we've just been talking a bit about how there's difficult decisions in one pot of money for funders. I'd like to ask you now, though, about your experience now that you're working at Novartis. Like, how do you approach this from that lens? Because obviously it's slightly different from the industry perspective. Do you consider things in a different way?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there are some similarities. I think the main thing to say is that we have a running list of about 50 disease areas that we sort of keep an eye on, mostly composed of neglected tropical diseases and emerging infectious diseases. And we consider 3 main things. One is unmet need, so very similar in that sense to the funder approach. The next is probably the most important, but also the most challenging, which is scientific tractability. We don't necessarily, it could be, for example, that in order for a field to move forward, there needs to be more or different biology or different way in which you could approach an intervention. And if that's not there, then we might assess that we can't move into that disease. You also need, of course, a lot of internal expertise in terms of being able to run in vitro assays and in vivo studies. So we have to look at all of those things for the scientific tractability. And then the third thing is partnerships. You know, I think without exception, our global health portfolio has had co-funding where Novartis has contributed and funders have contributed. So we've had funding over the years from Wellcome, from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, from the NIH, and others. So this is a really important part, and not just for early stages of development. It explains why we have the assets in our portfolio, but we need partnerships all the way through. So we have development partnerships with MMV for some candidates in our malaria portfolio. We have partnerships with DNDi for visual leishmaniasis. And we're working with them on Chagas for biomarkers as well. And then it's really important in the access space, but of course, the different people engaged in all of those spaces, they change in terms of what their own organizational priorities are.
So partnerships are obviously really important, and there was a question earlier on about how funders in particular, but I guess partners who work in the neglected disease R&D space, how should we best be making those connections and monitoring those connections, because we obviously work in one ecosystem, and so your decisions could directly affect someone else's. So I don't know if you could talk a bit more about the importance of partnerships to what you do and any experience you've got in terms of bringing partners together and trying to align priorities, since we're all kind of working in the same space and have finite funding.
That's a great question. We're constantly looking for partnerships at all stages of development, and it's really not easy, because sometimes it's very difficult. I'm sure when anyone is seeking funding, whether they're an academic wanting to do translational research, looking for the right funding pool, we find ourselves actually in a similar position of going to funders, learning what their priorities are and finding if there are any opportunities for complementarity. And there's no magic formula, unfortunately. We do find ourselves in the challenge that we've seen is that it might be that when we started a project in R&D, that the support was there. But then by the time, because obviously development takes a long time, so by the time, however many years later, you have a candidate and it's ready for clinical studies, it could be that that organization has changed their funding priority and made a different decision. And so we have gaps like that in our portfolio where we haven't been able to find ongoing funding support. And I think you'll probably find that across quite a lot of the projects that are in the GFinder pipeline.
Okay. We have another question from the audience now on partnerships. How can partnerships between major pharma companies be facilitated? So I guess how do the wee people out here who don't maybe work with industry, how do you start an engagement with an industry partner potentially?
It's so broad, so I'm not sure of the context. With R&D, then, often we have representatives at conferences. You can always, there'll be, for example, we were at ASTMH in November. There was a reasonable team of us presenting posters and others. So there'll be ways in which to exchange, people presenting at symposia. So there's opportunities for interaction there. There's also formal ways in which people can get in touch. We have business development teams. People can contact, and if they have, for example, if we're talking about product development, if they have projects that they're developing and they're looking for partners, if they're in diseases of areas of interest, then certainly something we can have engaged discussions on. If we're talking about I presume most people on this call are interested in earlier stages of R&D, but if we're talking about access-related partnerships, then it depends entirely on the alignment in terms of the disease area. because we would have to have a product that would be useful in a community for us to then engage and work with those particular partners to reach patients.
Thanks, Bethan. And if you have any further questions for Bethan, do add them into the chat. But I think we've got a follow-up question. Let me just see what that is. How can private sector pool resources and create joint projects and/or portfolios outside of a PDP setup? That's from Pauline Williams.
That's also a great question. I mean, I think it would depend entirely on where the funding was coming from. I think collaborations are possible, but it then depends entirely on whether the group that wants to collaborate is also hoping that they'll be funded from pharma. I think that's when things might start to be more challenging. I mean, maybe to explain, at Novartis, we have ring-fenced funding. We made a commitment at Kigali in 2022, a 5-year commitment, and we have ring-fenced funding, which means actually if we want to consider new disease areas, then then that's a set of challenging discussions. But it also means that we don't have money to spend externally with new researchers. So I think it really depends on, because with the PDP is playing a really important role. It could be providing funding to the academic partner, for example, helping with access to all sorts of disease models and in vitro assays, whatever stage of development they might be at. And in some cases, actually providing like a lot of consultancy and expertise, because some of those teams don't have that expertise. So it really will depend a lot on what it is that, in order to form a collaboration, what is actually needed on both sides and what the mutual benefit is.
And all of these partnerships obviously take time and effort to create, in addition to the lengthy time that it can take to undertake R&D as well. So I think important to factor that into the equation. I'll maybe pivot now. Something that's come out quite strongly in the GFINDER report this year is like the increasing funding for dengue drugs. And climate change is obviously a hot topic, pardon the pun, and we're seeing changing disease patterns. How are you considering this in your work right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for the question. So, I mean, across the organisation, there's a lot of work looking at climate change and how an organisation like Novartis can respond to that. And it's sort of for the global health team, we only need to look at our own portfolio to see that actually we need to maintain our efforts in the spaces that we're in, because, we have a portfolio in dengue, we have a portfolio in malaria, we have a portfolio in leishmaniasis and Chagas. So, where we have these vector-borne diseases that are likely to cause more of an impact, as more communities become affected by these diseases, as whichever vector it is spreading, then we think that actually we are already sort of well placed to help meet the changing needs. That's not to say there couldn't be like other things that come up. Like many organizations, we have a pandemic preparedness team, and that team takes the time to sort of continuously review what's happening in terms of emerging infectious diseases and should we be doing more. So those are the ways in which we are responding at the moment to the I won't even say threat of climate change, but the realization of climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and more to come, I'm sure, on that in the future. So we'll be watching the portfolio with interest. Thank you, Bethan, for sharing those insights. I think wonderful to have the two perspectives from the funding side and the industry side. I think that's really beneficial for the audience to hear that. I will pivot now and we will ask George to come online as we move to the next section of the the launch event today, and we're going to be talking this time about strengthening your investment case for the greatest return. So thinking more about that impact. So George, can I hand over to you to share your initial thoughts? And whilst George is talking, please add your comments and questions for him, as we'll be opening up the Q&A after he's finished speaking. George, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and thanks for the chance to join all of you. I feel like an imposter to the extent that you've asked someone who's a 17-year access and delivery focused person to come talk about an R&D focused report, but I see a lot of value in that. So the imposter syndrome has diminished as I've tried to connect the dots around what some of the questions that we're discussing here about guiding smart decisions and pointing R&D to things that will actually deliver impact. I think that's why you've invited me here, and that's certainly the way I've tried to structure my comments, which will be quite brief because I think there's some Q&A things that I want to be able to unpack with you in a more dialogue way. But let me just make a few quick observations if I can. And again, when you talk about strengthening investment case for greatest returns, I do think in the lens of a product development partnership. So I work for Medicines for Malaria Venture. We have focused for 25 years on developing new medicines for malaria. And then because of my hat says access to medicines, we often try to think very integrally around the linkage between what's coming through R&D and where it really is going to be delivering impact. So thinking about, how investment cases internally get debated, I just want to quote something that you guys had in your report, which I liked. I thought it spoke wisely across the whole domain of the different diseases we're talking about. It said, focusing on impact rather than just regulatory approval helps to keep the interest of patients at the heart of R&D decisions. Seems obvious enough, but it's an important thing to recapture. It goes on to say, as with the M72 TB vaccine, looking at a product's role in actual communities can guide not only how much funding it deserves, but how well it complements or replaces other tools, ensuring that R&D genuinely improves lives. So there's a lot of wisdom in that observation, even though it seems quite obvious, because it does force us, and I'm going to say us in a broad way here, us as drug developers, us as people investing in research, to really have something that one of our donors insists on, a clear theory of change. What the issue is, how this investment is going to be part of a solution, how you will then hope to be able to see, literally picture a product journey heading into an impact zone, and then asking yourself, aside from the aspirational impact you wanted to see, how will you be able to measure it? How will you be able to untangle that complex but really critical notion of complementarity? If you can answer those questions, and again, for me as an R&D linked access person, we push on these questions really, really hard in developing the investment cases for products. So we have to understand the environment into which they're coming, what some of the future parallel evolution of other tools might be, and then ultimately getting better and better. And we are not there yet as an R&D driven organization, but we're trying to get there. But with this community that we work within, patients, partners, other researchers, ministries of health, funders, to have a clear set of metrics, to be able to say, we know what it is we're trying to accomplish, and we really can come back and pull out an impact metric yardstick and be honest in saying we're on track or not. So these are the kind of interrogations that I think anyone in R&D needs to be doing, and the people who fund their work need to be doing. I think it might be in some of the Q&A, but let me just unpack something that's really important in the malaria space. So again, I'll recap. I work in access to medicines. My organization works on developing medicines. The question of what vaccines have done in the malaria space is huge. It's an epic moment. It's a transformational moment. It's one of tremendous excitement. But I think in terms of a theory of change, what I've seen lacking in some of the broader understanding of how one new technology can or cannot impact the whole ecosystem of malaria. It's been really compelling or telling to me to see the way popular media analysis really doesn't get what the big deal is about vaccines, and how it attributes things inappropriately to what the vaccines will be able to do. And this is through no ill intent on anyone's side, but it betrays a lack of understanding of how the matrix of things need to come together. Let me be very specific. What we've seen with the new vaccines that, well, RTSS had to work incredibly arduously for years, even after regulatory approval, to get traction. We can discuss that in another 2,000-word blog if it was the best use of funds and time to spend several more years developing an implementation program while countries were lining up waiting for probably 6 years in the wings for this to finally come along. But it did. R21 came much faster. But at the end of the day, let's celebrate what they're doing and acknowledge what they're not able to do. These are life-saving tools targeting the most vulnerable populations, the young children, very young children. Basically, we know today more or less how we're going to be deploying these vaccines in children to 2 or 3 years old. Some questions around what we'll find out. It wasn't in the research protocols with 4 and 5-year-olds. So let's put a big wrapper around that. Saving lives of kids at risk of dying. Great. If that can help us push down the deaths from malaria from 600,000 to 100,000 to 50,000 to 20,000, what's there not to love about that? What it gets murky is when people start to attribute the acceleration of elimination. Now we're on top of the tools we need to eliminate malaria. And that's where the ignorance of understanding how malaria actually impacts communities, how it thrives, and how it will be here or not be here, comes through when people celebrate this new technology means we're now hyper accelerating elimination. To think about eliminating a disease, you have to pull back your camera lens, understand disease dynamics, understand the specifics of the way the disease thrives and transmits. And then when you start to get to that understanding, you'll realize that the biggest challenge we have for disease elimination in a case like malaria is the huge human reservoir of disease that sits completely outside the range of those tools like vaccination, and some of the other tools being discussed in the future, like monoclonal antibodies. So we celebrate what we have in hand for what it's doing. But if you keep asking the theory of change question, what else do I need to be bending a disease burden down so that I can talk about elimination legitimately? You ask broader questions. So Harriet, I'm going to ask you to flip up a slide just because I think it's a useful image to unpack a little further. It's a tale of two cities. It's a depressing slide, but it's also a slide that has some kernels of optimism. So yeah, this is a slide that compares two things. The WHO developed a global technical strategy in the malaria area to track out the journey downwards of malaria globally over 15 years. So look at the 2015 as your starting place and look at 2030 as where you want it to be. It wasn't the full elimination, but it was a huge deflation, utterly transforming what malaria would be by 2030. This was refreshed in 2021. But if you're a cynic or an overly simplified negative person, you'd say, look at the orange line across the top, which pretty much is where we are struggling along. And then look at the projected downward purple line where we were supposed to be. Look in 2025 how far off we are by a factor of 400%. We're way, way, way off track. You can look at that and go, there's something inherently wrong here. Or if you keep unpacking it, you can say, where are the various elements that are holding us back? And the story becomes more nuanced. Number one, we're not making progress against the ambitious targets because the ambitious targets were premised on a global investment across all malaria in science and delivery that was significantly more ambitious than anything we're close to today. In other words, we're below 50% of the funding that was needed to make the GTS happen. So on the one hand, we acknowledge that the envelopes haven't emerged. We don't have the means to do everything that was promised in the GTS. The second thing that is behind that story is, if given some of the climate change, the disruptions we've had in health systems in several countries with high burdens, if we weren't doing this work, what the counterfactual is what those trend lines would actually have looked like. In other words, holding your own against a shifting disease dynamic isn't a bad thing. It's just not as great as being able to drop it by 75%. So that needs to be celebrated, and it's hard to tell that when you see a flatline story like that. And then ultimately, I think what we have to unpack here is what kind of new technologies were expected in the 2020 to 2030 that we're going to accelerate that haven't necessarily emerged. And this then, so you can let go of the screen now if you want. This then comes back to the questions of smart investments. If we do want to make smart investments, I think we have to continue to evolve our understanding about how the current set of tools are addressing or not addressing major gaps. And so just in closing, I just want to make this reflection. The technology of vaccination, until it can begin offering something which is population-wide protection, immune conferring, or diminishing the human parasite reservoir, then we can't start equating that single intervention with a super fast track to get us back on line with the GTS. If, on the other hand, you start to look at the complementarity of modalities that will protect people for long periods of time while also shrinking what is the constant circulating parasite reservoir, then you start to build a picture that has contributions that you can assign to the different investments you'll be making. So you really do have to take the time to know your disease, understand the very specific contributions and shortfalls of what comes together, and then have a theory of change that says, I can see these puzzle pieces coming together. Malaria is not going to disappear anywhere close to those lines that the GTS put forward on a single magic intervention. It can happen if the R&D delivery of the right new tools that address these human parasite reservoirs across communities complement the reduction in mortality that something like new vaccines that we've seen will offer for the most vulnerable populations, who are children under 5. So I'm going to stop there, Harriet. I know we had Lindsay, we had a few questions maybe that we wanted to go back and forth on, but let me see if there's questions that would come out of that, or if there's anything that you wanted me to touch on.
Thank you, George. That was brilliant. And as depressing as that slide is, I think it's really powerful for us to see that and be reminded of how off track it is for these targets. I mean, important to set these targets so that we've got something to shoot for, but also to unpack why we're not quite where we wanted to be. And there's a comment actually that may be relevant to this in the question section, which was, what about fluctuations of these endeavours due to political instability, climate change, human migration? Obviously factors that you wouldn't anticipate when you're setting some of these targets, but still important there. And I guess maybe flowing on from that, and something that we talked briefly about before when we were talking about this session, was the growing focus of regionalisation on global health R&D. And I'm interested to know how you would see this working for malaria R&D and in the context of your work.
Yeah, no, it's a critical question. It's that has a lot of new dynamism around it, which I think is great. I think it's overdue to refocus some of the questions, not just on the how R&D gets done, but some of the concrete outputs of pursuing R&D in a certain way that will long-term be really shifting or expanding the focus of R&D power and research breakthroughs. And then as a case study, a lot of the R&D we've done in terms of clinical programs have been done with some leading institutions in malaria endemic countries. And I think it's been great. I think these institutions, thanks to their own positioning in the R&D space, have really grown beautifully in the last 15 years. But I do sense a certain impatience with some of the stakeholders who'd like to see perhaps a more purposeful or deliberate outcome, maybe even making it a stated goal that in the conduct of research in the future, a defined legacy or defined output is in fact going to be a measurable change in the research capacity, the research leadership of institutions that are, in our case, in malaria endemic countries. So I think it continues a trend, but puts an even greater focus on saying, how will we know we're effectively accomplishing a fundamental shift in how research access work is led by strong partners who are in these countries and on a sustainable basis will be there when the last malaria case is eliminated. So that it's a challenge for us, but all of us working in this space to say, yeah, we need to put forward metrics, credible plans, time-bound activities that say, you can see we are, as a community, helping build longer-term, sustainable, strong institutions. And it's a dialogue that right now is really being kicked off quite earnestly with a lot of the funders of PDPs.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. We now have two questions from the audience as well. The first one, can you speak to what kinds of integrated R&D disease investments are needed to address malaria, such as diagnostics, preventions, and treatments for a broader range of febrile diseases? And I guess one of the questions I had was, how do we move the dial for patients? Like, what is the R&D investment case for malaria now, essentially?
Yeah. So, well, if I stick at first just to malaria, there's no question that the models that show us that we could see acceleration of disease reduction have to be able to address a number of things. Resistance has become much more of a real threat today in countries that even as little as 8 years ago, we had high degree of confidence that existing tools were going to continue performing it. In the example of uncomplicated malaria, 95% efficacy. So on the one hand, right now, we have an issue, which is to stay on top of the threat of, a real threat now, of the spread of drug resistance in Africa. So what kind of tools do we need? We need to be carefully monitoring the ongoing live performance of existing tools to be ready to respond to diminishing effectiveness of things that we have been counting on, which could suddenly be undermined and really set us back in the race to elimination. So there are elements of surveillance, disease modeling, resistance tracking that now is becoming much more of a priority for this to be embedded know-how within countries, within local research institutions. Secondly, when we are talking about elimination pushes in countries, what we've seen over and over is the role of community engagement when you're actually trying to talk about the final march of 10 years left with 5% prevalence or less. If you don't have a strongly committed community to this effort, and frankly, a strongly committed public health support for it, it becomes much harder. Malaria is not unique in this. We've seen this as other diseases much closer to elimination, that the focus politically on diseases that are coming to much, much lower levels starts to wane. People have competing priorities, etc. So there's definitely a need to maintain a strong political focus. Now, I do want to talk about the notion of fever management in general. It is very true that malaria sits firmly in the space of primary care disease. That is, at least today in the management, maybe not the elimination planning, but in the management of any malaria case, aptly caught in time, early, it can be successfully handled through cheap, affordable diagnostics that work, medicines which are affordable that work, but you do need a health system that's able to respond. And in that way, responding to any feverish patient coming through the door of a health post requires a level of strength of basic primary care, where malaria will just be one of the indicators that we're working well in handling basic childhood diseases, common complaints of people living in those communities. And so I think there, when we start to set performance metrics around how well we're doing this, it can't be a malaria indicator only when you're talking about the need for basic health system performance. And malaria, I think, is just one bellwether indicator within how well is the health system performing on all fever management.
Thank you, George. Another question, specifically on malaria again. are you concerned that the slow rollout of a malaria vaccine will be replicated for future malaria products?
So I feel like the energy behind the R21 rollout is exciting, and I think a number of things have helped transform that. But yes, let me go back to my earlier comment. I do think that a breakthrough technology that had stringent regulatory approval, a very long phase 3 program, had to take, I would characterize as a detour, a multi-year detour in 4 countries to establish its usability, its adaptability or adoptability into health systems, was a luxurious and a time-killing approach to new product introduction. So absolutely, I mean, is it a concern that if we create large evidence hurdles versus a comment that Paul made earlier, you look at the role of countries like Ghana and Nigeria saying, we see enough clinical evidence, don't even need to wait for the phase 3. Our local regulators have looked at this. Our local guideline people have looked at this. We want to go. That's a very different worldview, which I hope we'll be seeing more of, versus a very structured, uniform, trained, single track approach, which can create real barriers to the speedy adoption of new technology. I don't think we can afford to have that replicated again when new breakthroughs come through, be it malaria or TB or anything else. And maybe this links back to the voice of countries, to the voice of disease burdened countries. Now that regulatory capacity we're seeing is strengthened in a number of disease burdened countries, and there's a stronger scientific base in countries to do their own evaluations, I hope that we'll see a lot less sort of monolithic, imposing evidence frameworks prior to countries being able to get going with new technologies.
Thank you, George. I think that is a great answer and lovely to bring it back to the countries, I think, as well, and the ownership that they have there. We're actually entering the last 10 minutes of the session. It's gone very quickly. So I think I'll just open it up to see if there's any last minute burning questions or anything that kind of cross cuts. There's one in the Q&A already, that's put in the chat already. We've been focusing on decision making. But I guess who is making the decisions is the question. Should it be only funders that we're talking about? And I think interested to hear perspectives from George, from Bethan, and from Paul as well, if you thought about that from the report side as well. Who is it that's making these decisions? Paul, can I come to you first?
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in to say, look, doing smart things with your time and money is kind of good life advice generally. And you know, whether or not you have a large pool of money to allocate to R&D, you should probably do that. I explicitly acknowledged, I guess I was speaking more to regulators than funders in some places. And you know, everyone down the chain should be thinking about making the best decisions. But then I think about us as a small organization, and you know, should we be calculating the impact of all the different projects we could do, or you know, realistically we're putting one foot in front of another and trying to do projects that we think are a good idea without some sort of formal mechanism. So it can be hard to practice what you preach, I guess, as far as formally thinking about the impact of what you do. But it doesn't mean it's not smart advice for everyone in every stage of R&D or indeed life.
Bethan, do you have any thoughts on who are we targeting these decisions?
Yeah, this is tricky, isn't it? I mean, I'm just thinking, like, in terms of, like, from the funding perspective, they have the money, so arguably you could say, hey, they should choose, right? But of course, we're always talking about needing to move the center of decision making away from the global north into the countries that are impacted by these diseases. So, you know, even if we do have funding decisions, any decisions being made, we need to have that, ensure that our voice is included. But, you know, we're always going to have difficult decisions to make about which diseases to care about. And there will always be things that are ultra neglected. We have a program in our own portfolio which is very neglected, and that raises a lot of challenges for us. So whether you're an organization trying to decide what to do with your own set funding, or a bigger organisation trying to decide what to do with whatever level of funding you have, I think you need to ensure you've got the right voices at the table. But I don't know, it's an extremely difficult, there's no doubt there's an extremely difficult question to answer. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Bethan. George, I'd like to hear your
Yeah,
response
just
to that
I mean,
one.
I appreciate Melinda's question. I think I'm going to leave on a slightly optimistic note. When I first came into this work with the perspective of 2008, it felt much more monolithic in terms of much more of a disproportionate role, a subject object, with donors clearly having their own visions and frankly working with the World Health Organization, trying to align on large single solutions. And a lot of countries were on the receiving end of. I really feel like that has evolved a lot, and it's exciting. It's slow. This is intergenerational changes in some ways, but institutionally, the role of voices like Africa CDC, the emergence of African Medicines Authority, and it's a very long, arduous process, but it's happening. African pooled procurement mechanisms. The dynamics are shifting in ways where it will never go back to being that kind of monolithic one block of voices dictating to. And so I'm optimistic that the way that decisions will be getting made, how funding will be happening, what will be getting prioritized, it's going to be much richer, perhaps not without risk, perhaps without not conflict, but a much healthier, more diversified space than 15 years ago. And I think in that way, I'll say I'm optimistic that it's going to continue to evolve into something that looks more balanced, more equitable, but it won't be without disruptions. And I'm not saying it's a walk in the park, but it is exciting.
I think it's a good end note to end this conversation on. We've just entered the last 5 minutes, and I would just like to thank our speakers for taking the time. We've covered a lot of things in this session. We've gone from Paul telling us who is funding what and why, and learning about the flat funding and the decisions, the smart decisions that we need to make so that we continue to push forward the neglected disease R&D space. We've looked at the shifting landscape. We've talked about the need for partnerships. I think it's really important to say, what George was talking about in terms of what is it we're trying to achieve, and being clear about the metrics we need to track and monitor our progress there. And I think something that Bethan just raised there was not forgetting about the very neglected diseases. I'm very conscious that in the meeting today we've talked about TB, HIV, malaria, the big three as we call them, because they attract so much of this funding. But there is a lot of other diseases that we track, and in particular showing a spotlight for Yaws Diagnostics and trachoma, which this year tracked zero funding through the GFINDER survey, and those diseases that maybe don't cause mortality but maybe cause a high degree of morbidity, and not forgetting about those as we think about these smart decisions that we need to make. I think there are obviously diverse tools that we need. We can't just concentrate on one tool to make successes for people. And I guess just to end on that note, putting people at the heart of R&D, I think that is a really strong point to be made. It's come through in some of the questions and come through in our conversations and our report, and something that George highlighted in his discussion. I think that's really important, not to lose sight of why we're doing this. It is to make real world impact and to help make people's lives better for those living in low and middle income countries and suffering from these neglected diseases. On that note, we are now coming to a close. I'd just like to thank our speakers again. Thank you to Bethan and George for joining us today and sharing their insights. We really appreciate you coming along and sharing your different perspectives and giving different perspectives and reflections on our report that we've launched today. Thank you to Paul, Maddie and Alex for contributing. I'd just also like to acknowledge the rest of the Impact Global Health team. GFINDER really is work that's done by everyone across the organisation. It is not just the individuals you've seen on your screen today. So thank you to all the staff for producing this year's report. I hope it gives you many insights following on from this meeting today. Also, thank you to our survey participants. We go out to over 300 different organisations to get their funding data. If they didn't give us that, GFinder would not exist. So we are eternally grateful to them. Also, our funders. We are a not-for-profit organisation who rely on funding from the Gates Foundation and Open Philanthropy to do this work. So thank you to them. And finally, thank you to all of you for attending, for asking questions and engaging in the discussion. We hope that you got a lot out of this, but remember, it doesn't stop here. The report is online for you to dive into. There's loads more data and insights. And as I said at the start, if you have any questions or feedback for us, do get in touch. We'd also really appreciate it if you could share with your wider networks on social media or via email. You'll also receive a link to the recording of this session so that you can go back to anything that you may have missed. There's still time to catch up on that. And so while this event draws to a close, I just also want to signpost that we don't only focus on the GFinder Neglected Disease Report. We do have other events coming up in the next 12 months. Tomorrow, for example, we'll be launching the second 100 Days Mission scorecard, looking at pandemic preparedness with our partners, the International Pandemic Preparedness Secretariat. And later on this year, around April, we'll be launching our next sexual and reproductive health report that will be diving into our expanded scope on women's health conditions and doing a deep dive on sexually transmitted infections with an AMR risk. And we do have a mailing list that you can sign up to. So do that if you want to keep up to date with all of our activities. Also follow us on LinkedIn and Blue Sky if you want to do that. Paul, did you want to say anything in the final moment?
Just one last thing, which is that I've been made aware I often speak very fast in the context of these meetings. I do have my speaker notes if anyone would like to read it a little more at a sensible pace. Just contact us, I guess, and we can share those.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. Yes, I do that too. Being Scottish, I can sometimes be accused of that as well. But yeah, if anyone wants a bit more, and I think you've already given Paul a little bit of additional work on a blog post around those innovative financing and decision-making analysis that he was talking about as well. But we are just on time now. So I think that is all from us. Thank you to everyone again, and we hope to see you soon at the next Impact Global Health event. Thank you once again for joining, and goodbye.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.